We are live.
Okay.
Wonderful. Ariel, are you starting the introduction of me or?
No, I was just going to have you go ahead and get us started.
Okay. Okay, well, greetings, everyone. I hope you're all well, and thank you so much for joining us. I believe a lot of other people have RSVP'd, so as we move forward, they're going to come in. And I will encourage everyone who has a question all through as we speak to put it in the chat, and Ariel is going to check that out. And we will try to leave as much time as we can for an exchange at the end of the program. My name is Fatemeh Keshavarz. I am a professor of Persian at University of Maryland. I'm also director of the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures and Roshan Institute for Persian Studies. And I have been almost all my life teaching literature and culture. So I hope that this program brings up some issues that we all deal with and are close to our hearts in terms of how we can be educational activists, if you like, people who will bring real life, real issues to their classrooms. I have two distinguished guests, wonderful guests, and I hope that they both can join me because I know that one is in Iran right now, in Tehran. She was going to travel here last week and that was postponed, but she's very willing to join us. So hopefully that will happen. So let me introduce my guest, Professor Behrooz Ghamari first. I'm going to refer to him with first name and informal as a friend whom he has always been. So Behrooz participated in the Iranian Revolution in 1978 and 79 as a university student and took an active role in that and in the revolutionary movement that toppled the Pahlavi monarchy in Iran. He continued his political activism and struggle for betterment of the environment in which he lived after the revolution and was eventually arrested in 1981. So he spent an unsavory 5 years in prison. And after he was released, he traveled to the United States where he received his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. He has written multiple books, 3. I think he's been very meticulous about not inflating that, but he's done much more than that. And I want to particularly highlight Islam and Dissent, which has really become a classic in the field. Behrooz has always been a sociologist and historian who cares about culture and literature deeply. And in fact, he himself writes short stories. Currently, Professor Ghamari is professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, where he is also director of Sharmin and Bijan Mosawwar Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. So a warm welcome to Behrooz.
Thank you so much for having me.
And my other guest, whom I'm really hoping would be connecting with us from Tehran pretty soon, if she hasn't already, Kowsar Gowhari was born in 1979 in the United States. And actually that was the year where the revolution took place. A few months after she was born, her family went back to Iran and Kowsar grew up in Iran. And so in many ways, she's a native of Iran and the United States both. She did her studies in Iran up until her BA degree in fine arts. And in 2003, she immigrated to the United States, or rather she was an American, so returned to the United States while settling in her new home. She also did a JD degree in law. Again, Kowsar is very much like Behrooz, a person who has been involved in the social betterment of her environment and justice for people around her. She worked with American Red Cross, the American Civil Liberties Union, the International Rescue Committee, Catholic Charities of Baltimore, the US Government Office of Refugee Settlement, and so on. I can go on. In 2012, she received her JD degree, and after that, she went to Afghanistan and actually spent 2 years there working on the issues of corruption, and came back to the United States after 2 years. And she views her return as also a broad fight against corruption here and everywhere globally. She has a podcast called Transparency Loop that features in-depth interviews with various people, including Iranian figures, and I highly recommend it to those of you who want to know more about what is going on in Iran. So again, let me just remind you that we look forward to seeing any comments or questions you have, so feel free to put that in the chat as we speak. I'm going to open up by saying that many of us have really faced that, or started rather, thinking about fundamental issues, particularly since we have faced this global pandemic. And many things that were on our thoughts, but maybe not so central, like gender justice, racial justice, equal opportunity for all, and so on, are now much more compelling and immediate for many, many people, as we witnessed in the past few months with demonstrations on the streets. Now, the question is, how much do we really know about the world? And how much do we know even about the country in which we live, which could impact very seriously all of the movements that we would like to get engaged in, which is great to do. I think it would be fair to say that most of us have a general sense of nations and cultures that we view as being on equal standing with us, such as the Western Europe, parts of Asia. And then there are those who are often lumped together, identified as groups rather than individualized, very much generalized. And I don't think it would be wrong to say that one or two traits that they have, either physical, like the color of the skin, or ideological or religious, becomes the vehicle through which we think about them. What is worse is that they turn into kinds of ghosts in the background, people who threaten us in some vague and general way, but they don't have names and faces. We don't know really who they are. And I must say that this idea of these people being ghosts was not invented by me. There was this really stunningly original work published in 2004 by the sociologist Avery Gordon, who was called Ghostly Matters, and is basically focused on how these this is dangerous. It's not a conspiracy, but it's the way power works in invisible ways, by marginalizing or sometimes even effacing totally the people who fit into the wrong kinds of categories that we want to have dealings with. Most of us have heard things about Iran, but let me give you a couple of examples to make it clear what I mean by this presence being a ghostly presence rather than an informed and clear presence. For example, the recent deal, the so-called peace deal done between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, which, by the way, have had a very long history of relationships together, but nonetheless was put forth as a breakthrough peace agreement, whatever that way we see it. One of the threats kind of dangled in the air, one of the reasons why this was so important was the threat of Iran in the region. the threat of Iran against Iraq, against Afghanistan, against Saudi Arabia, and against the United Arab Emirates. Now, there are hardly ever any analysis about what that means and in what way is in Iran's interest to threaten these countries. Nonetheless, we all saw the ghostly presence of Iran threatening peace in the region. And fortunately, this is not limited to political scene. Culturally and academically, this happens quite regularly. And one example, I mean, only a few weeks ago, a very loving friend sent me this link. The BBC cultural section on its website has a section dedicated to Sadi of Shiraz. Yes, well, I'm a poetry freak and I love that. And I went back to read all of that, and he's elevated as a humanistic mind, besides, of course, a master lyricist. And great, you know, it's this person said all humanity is one big body, and we are limbs on that body. If one limb is in pain, everybody is in pain. And if you're not feeling that pain, you cannot call yourself a human being. This is the kind of mentality he had. Fine. And then I just kind of skimmed through and I see this pull quote in the middle of the article, large, that says, in spite of the inhumanity and terror surrounding him, Sadi had faith and hope in mankind. And yes, there were wars going on, not in the city in which he lived, and actually traveled a lot. But this was never explained. What was the inhumanity that surrounded him? Because he had teachers from whom he learned about his humanity. It's never explained what the exact terror was happening, because Shiraz was actually a city at the time flourishing. Even the Mongols didn't invade Shiraz. So just to give you an example of how these little droplets, and sometimes bigger than droplets of threat, thrown about this ghostly presence that is now happens to be Iran, prevent us from seeing Iranians. So with all of this in the background, I was absolutely delighted when the North American Iranian Friendship Society, which is an NGO in Iran, contacted me. And we had been in contact before for different other reasons. And they said, could we do a piece with music, which will bring Iranians and Americans together. And of course, I approached immediately my friend, Timothy Nelson, director of the In Series Opera, artistic director, who absolutely embraced it the first minute he heard about it. So there we are. What really encouraged me was, can this be a way where a few people will actually see Iranians? And because I don't think people could even imagine that there would be a young woman playing in Tehran Symphony that exists, and what is their life like, and so on. So without further ado, let's see this 6-minute video. And after that, we could return, and I'm going to invite Behrooz to comment on any of this and the video or anything else he likes to bring to our attention. So Ariel, we're ready when you play the video for us.
Just
Thank
a
you.
moment. Yeah, if you just want to keep talking for a moment and I will get it set up.
Sure. Well, it is, as I said, the goal was also, one goal was to bring these faces together. The other was that the musicians were feeling deeply affected by this pandemic globally, not just about Iran, but even about America. And they were saying, we want to, this is a way for us to honor each other's nation, each other's sufferers from COVID, and each other's people, the essential workers, the people who are in the front line and risk their lives to save others. So it was really a very moving moment when all the 3 months, that very complicated and busy 3 months where we were communicating with these musicians. And Behrooz, I think you did see the video and liked it. Yeah.
And we are ready to show the video.
Oh, okay.
So
We're ready to show the
Okay.
video. And so, okay, so we'll watch the video first.
Into banish.
Ein Held I wander, I find consolation. Purified by the passing of hate to love. My friends may forgive the errors of my ways, and that stay suspended in the joys of love.
The scattered pieces of broken hearts and splintered trees can become the raw materials for bridges. Nothing is lost forever. Stay together, friends. Don't scatter and sleep. Our friendship is made of being awake. Stay there, quivering in each moment like a drop of mercury. Did you hear? The winter's over. The basil and the carnations cannot control their laughter. The nightingale, back from his wandering, has been made singing master over all the birds. The trees reach out their congratulations. The soul goes dancing through the king's doorway, and enemies blush because they have seen the rose naked. Spring, the only fair judge, walks in the courtroom, and several December thieves steal away. Last year's miracles are last year's miracles. Will soon be forgotten. New creatures whirl in from non-existence, galaxies scattered around their feet. Have you met them? Do you hear the bird of a prophet crooning in the cradle? A single narcissus flower has been appointed inspector of kingdoms. A feast is set. Listen. The wind is pouring wine. Love used to hide inside images. No more. The orchard hangs out its lanterns. The dead come stumbling by in shrouds. Nothing can stay bound or be imprisoned. You say, in this poem here, and wait for what is next. I will. Poems are the rough notations for the music that we are.
All right.
That was so lovely.
Yes, it was. Of course, we are not suggesting that every Iranian plays in the symphony orchestra or everything there is absolutely, you know. But anyway, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for putting all this together with Code Pink and Fatemeh. You have been always a role model to follow. I think one of the really important issues that as educators we constantly face with is this kind of a vicious cycle of not having enough contact and communication with Iran, and then because of not a sustained contact and communication with Iran, people have a very negative image of the country, and it's to a certain degree it's true on both sides, you know, and since people have this kind of negative image, then there is less incentive to establish and create a contact. So that's why it's a vicious circle. Excuse me. And that's why a number of times that I have taught my class on modern Iran, I called the class "Everything you know about Iran is wrong," and really that's always the case. That many of my colleagues and friends, they teach different topics, but seldom any of my colleagues have to first start by erasing what people think about their topic and then start teaching the topic itself. So we actually always start from the point of in the negatives to get to zero, and then add to the perception, the understanding, the history, the culture. And I think that's the problem, that that kind of vision generates a totality of Iran. That totality, again, unfortunately, has a very kind of pejorative tone into it, and I think through education, through this kind of cultural contact, we try to sort of break that totality, because Iranian society, like American society, actually, I want to talk a little bit about similarities between Iran and the US, and that might surprise many people that how similar these two societies are. But like all societies, there are good things, there are bad things, there are good people, there are bad people, there are, you know, all different kinds of ideas you might disagree with, ideas you might be sympathetic to. But so that's why I said that the purpose of this kind of educational project and cultural exchange is to break down that totality and to look at Iran in its different parts. And of course, you know, we often, as this was such a beautiful example of I'm sure a surprise to many to realize that Tehran has a chamber orchestra, Tehran has a symphony orchestra, Tehran has different kind of musical experience, and also Tehran has things that might not look really familiar to us in the West. And I think we need to sort of find a way to appreciate both sides of that cultural and social expressions. Iranian music might, for example, sound very strange to many of us, and which is fine. I mean, this is actually then it puts the burden on our shoulders here to train our ears, exactly the same way that other people around the world train their ears to enjoy classical music, Western classical music. Other people around the world train their ears to enjoy jazz and rock and roll and pop music, Western pop music. So this is kind of a two-way road. I mean, as much as responsibility is on the shoulders of Iranians to grow and learn about different cultures, is also a responsibility on the shoulders of people who live in the US and in Europe to train and be open about different possibilities of literature, music, different kinds of cultural forms, and political expressions. And I think one thing that the Iranian people have learned profoundly in the last 40 years or so since the time of revolution is to think about themselves and their situation above and beyond the interest and of the state, and grow roots in their civil society to generate spaces in which they can express their desires, their demands, and their kind of objectives and projects that they want to engage with. And frankly, we have been so hopeful in the past 30 years or so to have a meaningful relationship between the two states, between the Iran and the US. Unfortunately, we are not synced right. I mean, whenever there is a possibility of rapprochement in the US, that possibility is closed on the Iranian side. Whenever there is a possibility of rapprochement on the Iranian side, that possibility is closed in the US side. And I think really time has come to overstep the states and think about possibilities of building bridges and conversations and communications above and beyond the channels that exist and are open through the two states. And we do our share. You know, we try to have academic exchange. We try to have these kind of programs that Fatemeh, you organized, and many other things. And I think it's just trying to make one side more felt, more visible, always is the first step. And to appreciate the humanity of the other side is always the first step. And we know that any time that powers that be and the people in the positions of power want to demonize or another people, they start from dehumanizing them. And unfortunately, again, we see this in the US at this moment, you know, about immigrants, and we see this beautiful, massive movement of Black Lives Matter here. And this is all about, you know, a large number of people in this country feeling dehumanized. And this is the kind of things that unfortunately, again, our governments do to other people around the world. And these efforts that we do is all about finding ways to make a case to humanize the other. And I'm curious, again, I don't want to talk for too long, that I'm sure people have questions, and I'm more than happy to engage in the conversation through these questions. And at some point, I do want to talk about the similarities between US and Iran, but I'm going to stop here and see if there are questions or if there are other comments that Fatemeh you want to.
Yeah, so let me see, somebody wrote to us as panelists, and I'm not reading it aloud because it's all the kind words of thanking us for doing this. So thank you for joining us. I think we feel that this is very much a part of our duty, but as educators, and as I said, one thing that the author of the Ghostly Matters comes to in the end is what we need here is inventing a language that has not been invented. Mm-hmm. In other words, just looking for different ways of speaking about the other, mm-hmm. and without dehumanizing them, without turning them into ghosts. But I want to get back, unless Ariel has a question for us.
We do. We have a question from.
Oh, right. So let's go ahead with the question, Ariel, please.
And she is asking what some of the difficulties were in putting this together, and also if this has been shown in Iran, and if so, through what medium?
Well, I think this is mostly addressed to me. Yes, it has. It was everything that becomes a DVD formally, or in this case, a recorded portion goes through state approval. So this was approved. We waited, in fact, for Rudaki Foundation, which was behind supporting this, and the hall that you saw, the beautiful Rudaki Hall, is one of the oldest, in fact, the oldest concert hall in Tehran, and it's now the complex, the Rudaki complex. And yes, they first approved it, and then it went through formal approval. It has been on social media and various places. I don't know if exactly what channels in Iran distributed it, but I know it went through approval. Difficulties were not speaking the language of music. I mean, I have a very rudimentary understanding of principles of music writing and all that. But so between Timothy and his team, the in-series opera, which did this work here, and the Chamber Orchestra, which except it kind of is a part of the Tehran Symphony, we were exchanging information about how to do what. For example, a harpsichord was not available at that moment, and there are actually harpsichords in Tehran, I was told later on, but one was not available to the musicians. And Timothy here played the harpsichord himself and sent it to them, so that when they were playing, they were hearing his harpsichord. And so it was, I think what was really wonderful about this more than anything else was that the two groups really discovered each other. I remember the first time that the sound came and Timothy listened to that, he was so impressed and surprised. He called me, he said, "This just made my day. My God, how well do they play?" And this is a musician who cares, by the way. It's not a person who's unaware of the rest of the world. So it took us about, we actually communicated first in very early April, and we were thinking we could release it by the end of April. Of course, it became May, and it became June, and in the end, we released it in July. So, it was just but everybody wanted to do their best work, and these were the difficulties involved. There was no, and I must say, I didn't work with the Iranian government on this. I had this NGO doing the work, but I didn't feel any sense that we have to change anything. So whatever that means, you know, we did the work, and I'm really hoping we do many more of these. Just all kinds of, you know, because music is a language that doesn't need translation. Behrooz, do you want to add anything?
There is actually another DVD, which is quite fascinating and beautiful piece by Nader Mashayekhi, who's a Iranian composer educated in Austria. And for those who are familiar with Iranian cinema, he's the son of Jamshid Mashayekhi, the famous Iranian actor. He's a composer trained in Vienna, and also a conductor. And he went back to Iran and planning to perform Mahler's Third Symphony there. And this whole video is about the training, the getting together of the orchestra, selecting the orchestra. It's such a beautiful, beautiful little video. I think it's called Passages, something like that. But if you search for Nader Mashayekhi and the Tehran Symphony, I'm sure you can find that. But that also, again, as you mentioned earlier, Fatemeh, that the surprise for many people who really don't know what goes on in Iran is that, you know, the camera follows all these players, many young women who play in the orchestra. They follow them to their homes, and you get to see their homes, how they practice, you know. And I highly recommend that also recording. That is like a 2-hour production.
I think I don't know what your reaction to this would be, Behrooz, but one of the pressures on doing these things, these kinds of works, is that no matter what you do, even if you just go to the home of a family and talk about food, as long as it's Iran, is viewed as political. So, institutions like ours have multiple constituencies. And for some, this is almost any positive note that shows anything that is happening that is good is kind of received as a political gesture towards the gesture of support towards the Iranian government. And no matter how hard you try to show that there's really no particular political direction to this. So that's one of the difficulties we face in saying the Iranian people should not be erased because the two states, as Behrooz pointed out, have failed to build a relationship that would be robust enough to go on for a while. How don't you feel that pressure, Behrooz?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, I now see that there's a question there about how actually what works best to humanize Iranians for students. There's a question there, and I think, you know, that's there's an easy and there's a difficult project there. The easy part is that, you know, you know, you can show films. Iranian cinema is such an important cinema in the world now, and I always think that perhaps showing Iranian films in classes, the best part of it is that the camera goes to the neighborhoods and to people's homes, and you know, to see that, you know, there are actually people like have concerns exactly like any other people around the world, you know, and also, you know, you see their anxieties, you know, and people do have anxieties, and I try so hard to make a distinction between how the policymakers understand Iranian intentions and politics, and create a separation between the capabilities of Iranians and their intentions. You know, we always read, like in the pages of the New York Times, Iranians are capable of targeting these cities in Europe. The Iranians are capable of targeting Tel Aviv. Iranians are capable. well, I mean, capabilities is something, but do they have the intentions of doing it? And the intention is often not discussed. And I try to show that, you know, with all its problems, the Iranian state, again, I don't want to say that, you know, that the Iranian state, this is not a apology for the Iranian state, but with all these problems, violations of human rights and patriarchic laws and all these things, they are not a bunch of crazy people. I mean, and unfortunately, this is such a dominant discourse in American politics, and the students come to class with that idea. Once you see that they can't distinguish between the Iranian president and the caliphate of the Islamic State, ISIS, then you know that there is a problem there. And this kind of thing that I think is so important to understand, that they also do have particular demands and interests. They live in a region that is contested, and then they want to assert their own authority, sometimes in a very authoritative and violent ways, sometimes with very legitimate rights that they want to exercise. So I think that making these kind of distinctions, even making the statement in Iranian government humanized is important. Again, no matter what we think about the kind of governance they have, it's very, very important to humanize them, because then we understand that they have particular forms of strategic interest and with which we can engage. Many, many years ago, not many, many years ago, in 1980s, this is another thing that when I tell my students, like, you know, in the recent book that was published in 1998, and everybody laughs, of course, you know, that shows my age, you know, that 1998 is a very recent time. But Henry Pratt was the director of Iran desk at the State Department. And I think in 1986 or 1987, he said something very interesting that nobody, of course, listened to him. He said that Iranians are basically interested in security and economic development inside, rather than exporting their revolution outside. Even, you know, they're really not interested in exporting the revolution. So much as they do these kind of things outside, is always to not for dominion abroad. This is to secure their own interests domestically. And they've shown this. I mean, they're very pragmatic. And again, all these things I say to argue that even dealing with the Islamic Republic, one needs to start from finding a way to humanize them. And this is a good lesson for Iranians as well, to think that once they want to deal with the American government, they need to humanize them. They can't deal with American government while they call them the Great Satan. I mean, the Great Satan means that they're dehumanizing American government. And in that sense, I think this is from very, very meta level of state politics to a very, very low level of neighborhood associations. We need to start from thinking about people's intentions and how they sort of give meaning to their own presence in this world, and how they define their own interests, and find a way, find a conduit to get into a conversation and engagement with them based on that very particular understanding of how they define themselves in this world.
Yeah. And if there's one other question that I can see, and I'm sure Ariel wants to pose it, but let me just follow up to what you say. One of the messages that I try to give my students is that in this process of humanizing the other, we are not doing a favor to them alone. we are doing a favor to ourselves. We are allowing ourselves to learn about who they are, the complexity of the situation. And we are allowing ourselves to imagine developing a real relationship with these people and benefiting from it, rather than staying in this isolated space of, I cannot have anything to do with these people, either because they're the great Satan or because they are these religious fanatics in Iran, whatever it is that we choose. So there is a question that, Ariel, do you want to pose that, or should I read it to Behrooz? Or maybe Behrooz, you can read it himself.
Go ahead and read it.
First, let me just post this link, because I saw that somebody was asking about the video I mentioned. I'm posting the Amazon. I'm sorry that I'm posting in Amazon. I couldn't find anywhere else. But this is the video I mentioned about Nader Mashayikhi.
Wonderful.
Called Gozaran, yes. So what's the question now?
Okay, so the question is, I think we went, from a person who says, I watch a lot of YouTube about Iran. Why do some think tanks want war so badly with Iran?
Oh God.
Oh, that's a big question. And you did give the link. So, okay.
Let me say this, that again, I'm a historian and sociologist, so I always, as my old professor in history department when I was getting my PhD told me that there's a difference between historians and sociologists. Sociologists don't know their history, and historians are sociologists without the brain, like we don't think about it. So I hope I'm not offending anyone out there. President Eisenhower in 1950s, President Eisenhower said that he was worried that a military-industrial complex is basically hijacking American foreign policy in 1950s. And I think that concern very much has been materialized in the past 2-3 decades. And in the olden days, when I went to school, people said that the Western interest in the Middle East, American, the British, the French, was always about oil, and everybody says that like oil is the problem. This is the black gold and the curse that has descended upon the Middle East, and the interest is oil. I don't think that has changed much, but on top of that, now we have this interest in selling arms. More than 35% of the entire world arms sales happens in the Middle East. So you can imagine how important it is to keep the Middle East in the constant state of threat of war, or a low-level war. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I do not believe that some people are sitting around and saying that, okay, let's do this and that. But this is a mentality. This is a sort of a very specific kind of strategic thinking that obviously, when Mohammed bin Salman visited the White House, I think President Trump perhaps said the most honest thing I've ever heard any American president say about this thing, that when people were pressuring him not to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, a $120 billion arms deal to Saudi Arabia, President Trump held this piece of paper. He said that we are selling these arms because we are talking about 140,000 American jobs, So because you manufacture these things in the US, and there are contracts, there are billions and billions of taxpayers' money that goes to these defense contractors. It's a huge industry. And just imagine if no one worries about a war in the Middle East. And just imagine if the UAE is not worried about it. Today, 2 days ago, we also read about selling of F-35 to United Arab Emirates, and they said that this is the Iran threat that they need to prepare themselves against. And you would think that, so is there a real possibility that Iran is going to attack UAE and invade the country? I would say, and you can say that you heard it from me here, with 100% certainty that there is zero possibility of Iran attacking UAE and invading the country. But nevertheless, this is the kind of discourse that is propagated, and the result of that is selling tanks. The result of that is selling missiles and fighter jets, and the result of that is creating a lot of American jobs, unfortunately. And I think I go back to what President Eisenhower said, that there is a problem when you have a very, very powerful military industrial complex hijacking your foreign policy. If that happens, that foreign policy is not a peace-driven foreign policy. That policy would be a war-driven foreign policy, because it just, it's good for business. And I think, again, I apologize for creating a caricature of the situation, but in this short period, I think I stand behind what I say 100%, that I think there is a real problem for American strategic thinking, if so long as it is not delinked from the interests of the military industrial complex in the US.
Right, thank you, Roshan. There's a question that I think I'd like to start responding to, and then you, of course, will be inviting you to comment on that, and that is, can we speak to how the perspectives of Iranian Americans might complicate our work, or how does that contribute to our work? Well, I think that unfortunately, TV series like The Shahs of Sunset or various other similar situations have done also a job of reducing the Iranian American community into particularly, politically oriented or totally unpolitically oriented, living in a geographically in a particular part of the country and driven by a particular incentive. The fact is that, the Iranian Americans are young, old, educated, highly educated, not so highly educated, coming from the field of humanities or science, and depending on various classes and backgrounds, but all of these come with different perspectives. So their views are colored by these, as you could imagine. The one thing that I would definitely want to add is that the second generation Iranian Americans are, for me, a very bright point in a very vast and diverse community of Iranian Americans. I see them as being committed to both cultures, American and Iranian, that there's no us and them, that, we Iranians are great, or no, we Americans are great. It's much more trying to understand both sides, that they are very often, again, I'm generalizing, very often committed to causes of justice, social justice, gender justice, and equal opportunities, and so on. And they want to do good in this community in which they live, and also they don't want harm to come to Iran. So I think that with them comes a new wave of hope. But again, I would say Iranians would come together, broadly speaking, around the specific goals that excite them. Some may be royalists, some may be leftists, some may be religious, some may be not so religious. And so depending on what brings them together, they are different from one another. The only other thing is a lot of them, I think, are discovering that they need to contribute to the American community and environment that they live in, and examples of which are my own institution, Roshan Institute for Persian Studies, and the institution that Behrooz is directing now, the Bijan Musawwar Rahmani. I don't want to pronounce that incorrectly, so the
Sharmin, yeah.
Yes,
Don't forget Sharmin, you know.
I know, women are always left out. Okay, Sharmin and Bijan Musawwar Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. So, and there are other centers being established elsewhere. So Iranians are also making that effort to acknowledging that it's important to create academic centers that don't necessarily reflect their personal view, but keep to work on that.
Yeah.
There was maybe in the short few minutes that we
Yeah,
have.
just a couple of minutes, and I totally agree. And I think there is so much hope invested on my part in the second generation Iranian Americans. And Iranian Americans are deeply politically divided community, especially my generation, who experienced the revolution. And I always say that, you know, we all carry this baggage, and that baggage doesn't allow people like me and my generation to come together as a community and have a sort of fresh perspective on our lives here and our relations with Iran. But I think the second generation Iranian Americans are in such a good place, and I've seen many of them both in academic setting and also in different kinds of entrepreneurship and corporations and so on and so forth, that are making a huge contribution to American society and have a very open mind about the relationship between the US and Iran and Iranians who live in Iran. So one has no other alternative than to be optimistic.
Yes, no, I absolutely share that. And as I said, they're a really bright spot there. So Ariel, I think we should be wrapping up. What do you say?
Yes, and I would thank everybody for joining us, and I would especially like to thank both of you for this incredible conversation.
Yeah, this is wonderful. I'm so sorry that Kowsar must have not been able to connect from Tehran. Yes. So hopefully there'll be other occasions, but I would like to thank Behrooz.
Thank you for having me.
A wonderful, bright, really point in all of the moments of conflict between Iran and the US. And then, you know, I've always, when I think of Behrooz, I think of a person who's positive, whose knowledge and whose efforts are always dedicated to positive and constructive things. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fatemeh. Thank you. So hopefully we see each other in person soon.
Very much so. Okay.
Just before we get off, I'd like to encourage everyone to go to codepink.org/Iran and check out the many actions that Code Pink has to work towards peace with Iran.
Yes.
Yes, and this is a great reminder to thank Code Pink.
Yes.
It has been with us there for decades. I remember, you know, from when the time I lived in another city, and I look forward to when the DO, you know, they were visiting and they were doing things, and you too, Ariel. So thank you both very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah.